In 2004, I graduated from medical school. And I don't know what 3 words you might use to describe yourselves. But at that time, I would have said I was hardworking, enthusiastic, and often heartbreakingly naive. One word I wouldn't have used, however, was feminist. I didn't identify with the concept of being a feminist. And I think one of the reasons for this is that the word can sometimes have negative connotations. And I didn't want to stand out, just keep my head down, get the job done. Also, being supported by so many men, both personally and professionally, I worried that identifying as a feminist might sound, well, a bit anti-men. I had an education with no perceivable limits. I had parents that gave me every opportunity. I never questioned that I could be a doctor. I never questioned my right to graduate from medical school. It didn't occur to me at that time that that right was borne out by the brave medical feminists of the 19th century. And that was my first step into medical feminism. Just 150 years ago, 7 women were the first to enrol onto a UK medical degree. Their lives were made difficult. They were charged more to attend than the men. They were instructed to find their own lecturers. And at one point, they were obstructed by hundreds of people from entering an anatomy exam. I don't know how nervous you get before exams. I know how nervous I am. I know how nervous I am today. Imagine being obstructed by hundreds of people from getting onto this stage, but then doing it because you know it's the right thing to do. These women were known as the Edinburgh Seven, and they went on to achieve everything that was expected of them and more, but they were never allowed to graduate for fear of upsetting the status quo. They were told to stop. They were told they couldn't, but they continued, and 5 of the 7 did actually graduate with medical degrees abroad, with many becoming key figures in establishing medical schools for women in the UK, in London, Edinburgh, and further afield. What amazing women. What pioneers. In my dreams, it may have been the Edinburgh 8, but I know I never would have been that brave. These women weren't asking for anything special. Quite the opposite. They were just asking for the same. And that's what feminism's asking for. The same. The same opportunities as men. The same respect, pay, the same treatment and health outcomes as men. Put like that, the negative connotations fall away, I think, because if you put it like that, it just sounds obvious. There has, of course, been huge progress in how women in medicine are represented today. And given the lag time of a few millennia, women have done really rather well. Women now make up the majority of doctors in training, and even in traditionally male-orientated specialties such as surgery, the proportion of women training is on the rise. However, there is some way to go, and the pipeline shows we lose many talented women on the way. Women are still relatively underrepresented in leadership roles, particularly in academia and surgery. Still, 2 out of every 3 consultants are men. And we're all aware that there's a gender pay gap, with women earning £1 for men's £1.17. Much of this does not happen intentionally, but it revolves around our pre-existing ideas about who makes a good surgeon, professor, or leader. And this was my second step into medical feminism. I heard 2 stories. I think some of you may have heard the first before. A father and son were travelling home from a football game and they were involved in a terrible car crash. The father is killed and the son is taken to the nearest hospital. He's quickly assessed, but it's decided he needs to go straight to theatre. The consultant surgeon arrives and declares, "You'll have to get the second-on consultant in from home. I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son." The question, of course, is who is the surgeon? When psychology students were asked that question, many overlooked the possibility that the surgeon could be the boy's mother. But we, as healthcare professionals, recognise the story and say, well, of course it could be the boy's mother. We don't have unconscious gender bias. So what is unconscious bias? Well, it's when we use our instinct. And our instinct is based up of our culture, background, personal experience. We use our instinct over objective analysis to make a snap judgment, and we can get it wrong. Then the second story. I hear from a colleague that she recently attended a very prestigious medical awards ceremony. The winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award was announced. And the professor that won is a household name for all medics, due in part to their authorship of a famous clinical text. As this professor stood to receive their award, a ripple of whispers went out around the room. I didn't realise Professor so-and-so was a woman. Did you? And it really annoyed my colleague that we're still surprised when the exceptional is achieved by women. But what really upset me when I heard this story, the thing that really grated, was that I thought this professor was a man. The person stood before you, telling you about unconscious gender bias has it. And if it exists in me, it's really likely it exists in you as well. It doesn't matter how many times you do the e-learning module, whilst eating a sandwich and checking your emails. I know you're doing it, we all do it. But the point is this. The e-learning module is not going to help you here. Instead, we have to call ourselves out on the occasions where our unconscious becomes conscious. Acknowledge it as more than just a passing thought. Only then can we start to rewire our minds. So I started to think about unconscious bias. If it was affecting the way I considered my colleagues, could it be affecting other things? For instance, could it be affecting the care I give my patients? And this is when I recognised this goes deeper than just workforce. It doesn't just affect the women's career pipelines, but it directly feeds into the care we're giving all women. And I realised that we, as a medical society, have been sleepwalking into male-orientated medicine. This is when I woke up and identified as a medical feminist. It was then I decided if the Edinburgh Seven could be so brave, then I needed to be a bit braver. And there was a story that needed to be told. Now, it's really hard for professions like medicine that are so grounded in belief of their own objectivity to recognise that they have biases. But medicine's not impenetrable. To fully understand why, we have to go right back to the beginning. Since the days of Hippocrates, the physicians, scientists, philosophers were all men. That meant that the male body became the default. The female body became the other. Here is an image you may find less familiar. When this image of a female chest wall and breasts was seen first on Twitter, it went viral, with so many people claiming it was so unusual to see it over the traditional male form. So what difference does using men as the default make? Well, as a GP registrar, I'm quite often struck by how many people tell me they're having adverse drug reactions, but I was particularly surprised how many women were telling me they were having reactions to drugs. So I looked a bit further. Historically, much of the research around drugs has been done on proportionally more male cells, male animal models, and relatively more male participants. There's an increasing body of evidence to say that female mice have different outcomes to male mice and that would translate to work in humans. I recently had a conversation with a neuroscientist at the university that I work in. I asked her what work she was doing. She explained she was looking at the effects of drugs on mice. She did look a bit taken back when I eagerly inquired about the gender of her mice. And I'm working on my preamble, but the point is this. She said she uses male mice because they're bigger and they don't have hormone cycles, so they have more consistent outcomes. And I get that, but the problem is this. Women have hormone cycles and inconsistency within those cycles. If we don't use the female mice, how do we know what's going to happen in human women? We then go on to administer drugs in gender-neutral doses, despite the obvious size, fat muscle, hormone ratio differences. And we wonder why women present with more adverse drug reactions. And here's the sting in the tail. Not only are we prescribing drugs that are in the wrong dose, or may not even work, but we may have dismissed a far earlier development stage drugs that didn't work for men, but may have actually worked for women? Are we, in fact, incorrectly prescribing for all women? And if it affects drugs, does it go further? Does it affect diagnosis? Well, you may have heard in the news about men and women having heart attacks. Men and women both present with an array of symptoms when having heart attacks. The most common, of course, is chest pain. But women present with relatively more associated symptoms, palpitations, nausea, that sort of thing. And the presence of those associated symptoms may cloud a clinician's judgment. We might not get to the diagnosis. But if we get over the first hurdle and suspect the diagnosis, we need to think about the tests we use to confirm the diagnosis. Currently, we use a blood test, and that blood test looks at the relative amount of an enzyme released from heart muscle when it's damaged. Up until relatively recently, we weren't aware that the cutoff, the threshold we were using, was set too high, and we were missing women's heart attacks. And that would make sense, because women's hearts are smaller. They would release relatively less of the enzyme. We then go on. These biases are leading to misdiagnosis, and as a consequence, women are 50% more likely to have a misdiagnosis following a heart attack than men. And the inequality goes further still. Women are less likely to receive the right intervention or the right drugs after a heart attack, and they are therefore at increased risk of death. Women are dying, and we're letting it happen. And I haven't even touched on the inequalities surrounding healthcare and research for conditions that exclusively affect women. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, the menopause, just to name a few. So I'm sat in my GP practice, potentially prescribing the wrong medication, missing diagnoses, and providing suboptimal care to women because of the way society has and still continues to influence the way that we consider men and women, and not because of objective biological truths. We can either carry on, or we can rethink it, reimagine it, rewrite it. Let's be brave. Let's change this argument. This is not men versus women. This is our past versus our future. Let's stop. Let's listen to women and question what we thought we knew. This doesn't have to be the other anymore. And I, for one, am so ready for that change, and I would love it if you would join me. We can all be medical feminists. We just need to be brave enough. Thank you.